It was really illogical. When you think about it, it's quite illogical to actually say, well, I'm gay and I'm into defending the gay community, but I don't care about anything else. It's ludicrous. It's important that if you're defending communities, that you also defend all communities and not just one.
It's really nice to be here speaking from Houseman's Bookshop, a long-established radical and left-wing pacifist bookshop in the building which was for many, many years the home of London Lesbian and Gay Switchboard.
Glad to be gay.
Yeah, glad to be gay.
Much, isn't it? You never to get right.
The group came together in response to the British miners' strike, which has often been described as a civil war without guns. It was a huge, huge industrial dispute. There hasn't been anything like it really since the 1926 general strike. This is Margaret Thatcher's government, who were clearly aiming to strike a mortal blow to the trade union movement in Britain. And part of what she did in that was her government sequestered the funds of the National Union. So the National Union put out an appeal globally, all around the world, for anybody who supported the miners to, instead of sending money to the trade union, to actually twin with individual mining communities. So LGSM started quite late on, about 3 months into the strike, as a result of Mark Ashton bumping into me just round the corner from where this interview is taking place, just before the 1984 Gay Pride March, and Mark said, "Hi Mike, how about taking some buckets and collecting for the miners at the Pride March?" And I said, "That's a great idea," and we did.
And I think it was fairly typical that the group, when it was formed, involved both people who were already involved in politics, in trade unions, and so forth. Generally, people who've been involved in the anti-apartheid movement and the Troops Out movement and other social movements, people involved in LGBT activism, people involved in trade unionism, and certainly people who'd already involved, like myself, I was involved in the Labour Party.
For me, it was somewhat different because I had 18 months previously been diagnosed HIV positive, which was a huge thing for me. But I remember I had seen an advertisement for a stand together around Greenham, Burfield and Aldermaston that was organised by this group called Gays for a Nuclear-Free Future. There was a coach that was leaving from Gays the Word. And when I arrived, the first person who came up to me was this guy called Nigel Young. And Nigel Young had been a political activist. He'd been a member of Gay Left Collective. Since I was going to be dead next week, anything that was suggested I could just go, yes, yeah, that's fine.
Looking back in retrospect at that, we'd had well over 100 people pass through our meetings. But I think with a lot of these things, not just LGSM, there was a core of activists, and there's probably about 10 or 15 of us who were consistently there doing things, and that includes us three.
And of course, by the end of the strike, the London LGSM, the original LGSM, had inspired other groups to set, and I think there were 11 LGSM groups across the country by the end of the strike. Well, I'm not quite sure why we went to Wales. It was fairly random. I think it was just a particular connection through Hugh, is that correct?
Yeah.
So one person who was involved fairly early had a connection with Dulles, and we contacted them and they responded favourably. Di Donovan came to meet a group of people in London.
Hefina, who was secretary of the Miners Support Group in Wales, read our letter out amongst the week's correspondence to the group, and there were about 40 people in the Miners Welfare Hall at that meeting. And when she read our letter out, it was met with laughter and giggles. And then the magic happened, because very quickly the laughter and giggles stopped, and they asked themselves why they were laughing. So it immediately went into a discussion about sexuality, etc. And they decided that they were going to extend exactly the same invitation to us as they had to all the other groups.
Over here, please. We're packing parcels.
We'll stay for a pint.
No, you're all right, Cliff. Welfare's had a change of atmosphere, if you know what I mean.
And so actually we absolutely encountered no hostility at all. The movie is a movie, it has to have drama, but we didn't.
But there was a huge, I mean, there was, incredible nervousness.
There was nervousness,
because when we went down, I mean, we were there were 2 Hackney transport, community transport, and I think a clapped out Volkswagen camper. So there must have been somewhere around about 30 of us. 27 on the first visit, and we got lost. We got totally lost, and we arrived, I think, somewhere around about 1 o'clock in the morning. So we had completely missed whatever was going to happen, and we all ended up on Donovan's floor.
Yeah.
So that aspect of the film is quite realistic, and I think the meeting with Donovan is quite realistic. I mean, he reacted in just that kind of way. Once we'd gone down and visited people, and we started to interact on an individual basis, I think that's when it kind of really started to develop. This was a community which had an enormous understanding of solidarity, an enormous history of internationalism in particular. So in Onkel Miner's welfare, where that amazing dance scene with Jonathan is set, the Lodge Committee sat and composed a telegram to Mao Zedong, congratulating him on the completion of the Great March. So this wasn't some little isolated village, not knowing what was happening in the world. They'd had this amazing relationship with the Republicans in the Spanish Civil War, which was really very much triggered by an earlier incident where the coal owners had brought in Asturian miners as strike breakers. So these miners came from Asturias in northern Spain and found that they'd been brought in as strike breakers. They were anarcho-syndicalists, all of them. They joined the strike. And so they were kind of welcomed into the community. So in Abercraf, where Sian lived during the strike, I mean, there's a row of houses called Spaniards Row, which is where they originally lived.
The heartland of collecting was outside gay pubs and clubs, and it literally was outside because a lot of pub and club owners were hostile to the miners, so they wouldn't actually let us stand inside. But we also collected outside gays. There were a bookshop every Saturday, and we'd have collections outside Camden Town Tube Station occasionally.
Back to the miners and back to socialism.
And of course, the biggest fundraiser was the Pits and Perverts Ball, and that we were very lucky for that to happen because Mark Ashton was a personal friend of Jimmy Somerville, who was boss Bronscopy, and so Jimmy didn't hesitate to commit to this, and that raised £5,500 in one night, which was a lot of money back then, and 1,500 people came to it.
I mean, one fundraising thing which I have really strong memories of, which I disappointed didn't make it into the film, we actually two of us went to northern Italy, travelling around northern Italy in a coach with a Striking Miners rugby 15. They played rugby and we spoke at various lesbian and gay venues in northern Italy, in Milano and Bologna and Ferrara and places. And I particularly remember speaking at the Gay Men's Knitting Circle in Milan Gay Centre. There were all these kind of bearded men sitting knitting the most exotic and amazing creations while we talked about the miners' strike, and we raised a fair bit of money. Our relationship continued more was because like the end of the strike, it didn't just stop, did
No.
it? So we carried on collecting money, but then also we went into that really bleak period where people were dying and so forth, and people like Sian and Havina and others were coming up to funerals and visiting people in hospital, and that relationship continued in an intense way. Yes.
And they came and they marched with us on Gay Pride.
Yeah, and they agitated at the party conference.
Yeah, and
all
that
sort of stuff.
was just extraordinary.
Yes.
Because they'd always said that, we had sort of, worn their badge with pride, and they would do the same for us, and true to their word, they did. And that was, that's something which is just amazing. When you think, in a lot of people's heads, the idea that sort of, miners are going to be homophobes, and they're a real problem, and they are our oppressors. And this was absolutely not the case. And I think it's the most extraordinary thing that you can say, that if it wasn't for, the National Union of Miners, but miners in general, and particularly the South Wales miners, we would not have civil partnerships. We would not have lesbian and gay rights in the way that we do. And I think that is the most extraordinary thing.
It's so counterintuitive. I mean, one of the wicked things that the Thatcher and the media did treat the miners in the strike was that they kind of brutalised them. Thatcher famously used the expression "the enemy within." They were referred to as the mob, and all the television news always showed miners being violent to the police. Never actually show you what prompted that in the first place, and that was the police attacking the miners. It was always the miners attacking the police. It's quite outrageous. So with that kind of characterisation of them all being kind of like brutes or whatever, this story countermands that, because actually who played a major part, isn't all due to the miners, but one group of people who had a major role to play in the emancipation of homosexual men in Britain and lesbians today is the British coal miners. Brilliant.
And I think for a lot of us, the first person who we knew personally who died was Mark. I mean, that kind of really brought it home to us. And then after that, more and more people got ill, and more people were dying.
And with Mark, it was just so fast. It was incredible. It was 11 days from diagnosis to death.
But that was one of the things, wasn't it? In those days, there was so little. So people would sort of present, and they were already, at what would be like sort of, third stage. So there was very little warning and very little chance. And of course, there was nothing. There was a lot of support, which was extraordinary. But sort of, there was no medication. Well, there was sort of the poison chalice of failed chemotherapy drugs.
Yes, and I mean, the only tool that was available to try to combat the epidemic was education.
Yeah.
And of course, Thatcher's government brought in Section 28, which criminalised any teaching about gay relationships in
promotion of
homosexuality as a pretend family relationship was the phrase, but effectively it put a stop to any kind of education happening in schools aimed at young gay men in particular. So the people who were most at risk were denied the opportunity to learn about it and let it. So the efforts that were being made by people like Terence Higgins Trust and the lesbian and gay community generally were entirely deliberately undermined by Thatcher's decision to introduce Section 28, and thousands died because of it.
After the strike, in the mining communities, Thatcher was doing all her damnedest to make life worse for us. Meanwhile, the mining communities are collecting for HIV charities, they're spreading the word, they're educating people.
And what is so amazing is the fact that still the effect of Section 28 is still reverberating around schools, because there is very little proper education relationship And yet, what has happened, and what has happened because of the film, that there are these extraordinary pride societies that are happening within schools. I mean, unheard of, unthinkable. I mean, in my day. They are, but I mean, I think what is extraordinary is that I think that we're much stronger than we were previously. You know, that was terrifying. You know, Trump's just almost on the first day that he was in the Oval Office, he was countermanding sort of many of the sort of the gay right legislation that Obama had helped to bring in. So hopefully, kind of, there will be, you know, response to that. There is already responses happening sort of in the States to Trump, and I mean...
Yeah, but we're certainly seeing a kind of a rise in not only individual homophobic acts and the rest of it, but also kind of state-sponsored homophobia.
But on the other hand, we have had some fantastic gains. I mean, I never would have believed in my lifetime that we'd come as far as we've come here. You know, we must never be complacent. You know, rights that were hard gained can be easily lost if we're complacent. But I mean, I think now, of all the gay members of Parliament, the Tory party actually has more out gay members of Parliament than any other parties. So this is the party
that's good it does us though.
This is the party that suppressed gay rights, yeah, Section 28, Clause 28. It was Labour and ourselves who helped to overturn all that and bring us the rights that we've got. And who comes out and benefits from it? The bloody Tories. Do you know what I mean? You couldn't make it up. Well, how the movie came about, I take you back to 1992, 8 years after the big miners' strike. There was a second smaller wave of pit closures under Michael Heseltine, who was a minister, and when what's it called?
John Major.
John Major was Prime Minister. And there was a young actor called Stephen Beresford who'd got a boyfriend who was 10 years older than him. And the boyfriend said, we should support the miners. And Stephen said, why on earth should we support the miners? And of course he walked into a trap because the boyfriend said, let me tell you a story. 10 minutes later, Stephen goes off to bed in a huff, thinking that this is just ridiculous, it's made up, it's a gay myth. And the boyfriend said, it's true, it happened. And that was that. And then he spent the next few days being curious as to find out if this was true. And of course, it's pre-internet, really. And he said it was very difficult to find anything, but he eventually did. Moving on, there used to be a very successful British movie company called Working Titles that was bought out by Hollywood, and when Hollywood bought it out, it plummeted. So the call went out to that the ingredients of success of Working Titles were British actors, British subjects set in Britain. And so Stephen Beresford was called in as a promising young talent to a meeting by David Livingstone, the producer, and that was it. David asked him if he got a story modelled on this British actors, British subjects, whatever, and Stephen couldn't think of anything, and he got up to leave the room. He had his hand on the door handle, and David looked at him and said, really? Nothing? Not even something in your wildest dreams you wouldn't ever expect to hit the silver screen? And Stephen now says that's the best pitch he's ever learnt in his life, because he just turned to David Livingstone and said, well, there is one story, but nobody's going to tell it. And of course David Livingstone said, I might. Stephen sat down. 10 minutes later, David Livingstone's in tears, just saying, that's it, go away and write it. And then Stephen had to try and track us down, and he saw a a video that we made at the time called All Out Dancing in Device, which is okay. I mean, it was an amateur thing, fine. Technology wasn't as good those days. But the thing that infuriated him about that, there were a list of names right at the end.
He had to find out of this list an unusual name, basically. And
my name being Michael Jackson, that's not unusual.
So that was no good. But happily, up came this name, Reggie Blennerhassett. And he thought, how many Blennerhassets can there possibly be? And by now there is Facebook. So he went to Facebook, looked, found that there was a Reggie Blennerhassett, got in touch with him, said, were you by any chance a member of Lesbian and Gay Men Support Miners? And Reggie replied, yes.
And he was very, very clear that he wasn't going to write a documentary. He wasn't going to tell the true story. He was going to dramatise, he was going to make things up, and he was going to aim it at a mass market, at the American market. So there were things that wouldn't be included, and there would be things that varied quite a lot from reality. So once he started writing, he went off and he wrote it. He didn't consult us, he didn't talk to us, we knew nothing about it until it was finished, and it was pretty much most of the filming had been done. And eventually the script ended up on the desk of Cameron McCracken, the managing director, I think, of Pathé Films. And he apparently read the script and said, I made The Iron Lady. I need to make amends. I want this film.
We were a bit apprehensive before we first ever saw it because it had been described as a rom-com, and Stephen had throughout told us that it probably wouldn't be as political as we might want it to be, which we kind of accepted. But in retrospect, from that very first screening when we all went to see it together with the people from Wales, I think it's a highly political movie, but what's clever is it's not hectoring, it's very subtle, and it covers politics in all sorts of different ways. And in fact, I think, yes, you could describe it as a rom-com, but it's also a Trojan horse movie. Yeah. People are enjoying it, they may not understand, but they're actually being politicised.
It's important also, I think, that, you know, because the film is not a documentary, it's fictionalised, some more of the reality comes out. The fact the film shows 4 or 5 people really is involved when there were close to 100. The book at least gives another dozen or 15 of those an opportunity to speak for themselves. Because I think it's a story which still has resonance, and it's certainly a story which has inspired people. And I think, you know, we're really proud of the legacy that we have of having inspired a young generation in the last few years because of the film. So various Lesbians, Gay Support the Miners groups, and Lesbians, Gay Support the migrants groups, and so forth.
Attacked by the media, attacked by the state, know what it's like to be attacked. That's why we're here openly as lesbians and gays and as socialists to support the miners. A victory for the miners is a victory for us all.
All I'd like to say in conclusion is victory to the miners, victory to the lesbians and gays, victory to the old, victory to the young, victory to the sick, and victory to the working class. Thank you.